Hi, all. Hope you're having fun on your break. We just have a little lecture about food safety, foodborne illness, and antibiotic resistance today. Okay, so goals and objectives are to learn about food safety. So you should be able to create a table of common foodborne illnesses. You should know the name, incubation time, and then common food sources and the symptoms that people experience. These are also covered on your RD exam and a couple of the domains. You should be able to describe guidelines for cleaning related to food safety, guidelines for preparation, outline some risky food behaviors and describe them, know the safe cooking temperatures for common meat, shellfish, and other foods, and also understand and diagram microbial resistance. So, millions of people every year get sick from the various forms of foodborne illness. Of these, over 100,000 are hospitalized, and about 3,000 die every year. So, I'll upload a version of this PowerPoint so you can access all these links. But I got all this information that I'm presenting from the CDC website, the FDA website, a little bit of World Health Organization, and also the Dietary Guidelines for Americans 2015. So if you go to the CDC website, you can see a list of all the common foodborne illnesses and read in a lot more depth beyond what I'm going to talk about in this presentation. But that's a really good resource for surveillance and just for general information. They also have a list of outbreaks, just telling you kind of the latest outbreaks that have happened, common foods that are instigators of outbreaks. So there's a link for that. Okay, now going into some of the common foodborne illnesses, these are listed on the CDC website as the most common foodborne illnesses and the most relevant foodborne illnesses. There's more, and there's actually pages on the CDC website where it breaks it out by bacterial, viral, and parasitic causes of foodborne illness. And these tables actually contain all three, bacterial, viral, and parasitic. So the botulism toxin is, of course, cause of disease, and it results from improperly canned foods. And back in the day, this might have been, more common in commercially canned foods, but now it's primarily home canned foods and just improperly home canned foods. The typical incubation is 18 to 36 hours, and as you know, muscle weakness and eventual paralysis are kind of what we think of as botulism, but also includes earlier signs of blurred speech, slurred speech, blurred vision, drooping eyelids, double vision, things like that, difficulty swallowing, some just general muscular problems. What you'll notice with really the vast majority of foodborne illnesses is they take a couple of days to manifest, so their typical incubation periods are long. And for the rest of your career, you're going to hear from people that the seafood they just ate made them sick, if they're throwing that up when they start throwing up, which is pretty unlikely most of the time. Usually it's something they had a couple days ago. So people generally are pretty bad at identifying the source of the foodborne illness because they probably don't even remember eating whatever it is that made them sick. Or it could have been more likely from like cross-contamination, with a dirty countertop or something like that. Campylobacter is primarily gotten from raw or undercooked poultry meat or pasteurized dairy products, incubation period of 2 to 5 days. Diarrhea, which may be bloody, cramping, abdominal pain, and fever. This is one of the most common forms of foodborne illness in the U.S. Clostridium is actually caused by foods that are improperly reheated or held at improper temperature. So people are more at risk if they're, buffet foods, things like catering, institutional service of foods, hospital trays, school trays, any foods that might be, are supposed to be served hot but are kind of sitting around at, 110 to 120 degrees are at high risk. So incubation period is a little less, 6 to 24 hours. fevers, and results in diarrhea and abdominal cramps. Cyclospora is the only parasite on the list here, and it actually causes this prolonged bacterial illness that can last weeks and months or longer. The incubation period is 2 to 14 days, and it was pretty recently discovered in the 90s, but it's a fairly common cause of ongoing bacterial illness. Diarrheal illness. It's commonly transmitted through unclean water, so it's more commonly widespread in countries that don't have well-developed sewer treatment systems, or sewage treatment systems. So that's Cyclospora. E. coli, we think of E. coli 017H7 as the main. So here we have some additional pathogens identified by the CDC as being very common foodborne illnesses. The top we have Listeria, which is especially dangerous for pregnant women. It can increase risk for preterm labor, and also the baby can be born with Listeria if the mom is affected. It has a very long incubation period, which can last typically between 3 to 30 days, but can be up to 70 days. So a person can have Listeria in their GI tract and pass it along without realizing that they're sick. It results in fever, muscle aches, headaches, stiff neck, and then what's especially challenging is bacteria are more likely to translocate outside of the GI tract with Listeria. Norovirus is another virus or pathogen that's commonly transmitted using food as a vehicle. It's usually transmitted by people who are sick or especially dirty surfaces in cramped spaces. So it's common, as you probably already know, on cruise ships. You can have norovirus outbreaks where a bunch of people on board the cruise ship are experiencing stomach pain, nausea, diarrhea, and vomiting, which is a bad scenario for a cruise ship. And then the ships are very hard to clean up after that. But then people who are sick can also contaminate any foods or beverages they're working with and contaminate surfaces they touch. So the typical incubation is 1 to 3 days for norovirus. Salmonella is commonly found in poultry, ground beef, and eggs. And for the eggs, it's actually found typically on the outside of the shell, and the inside can be contaminated once the egg is cracked, but it's unusual for there actually to be salmonella contamination inside the egg itself from the outset. Typical incubation is 12 to 72 hours, and symptoms include diarrhea, fever, and abdominal cramps. Shigella is kind of like E. coli in the way that it's passed when people accidentally consume feces. And so in places that don't have adequate sewage treatment systems, it can be more easily spread that way through unclean water and open sewage. But food service workers who are infected with Shigella can pass it on to other people by contaminating food. So typical incubation is 1 to 2 days, and symptoms are diarrhea, fever, and stomach cramps. Vibrio is associated almost exclusively with seafood and seawater, and brackish. So consuming raw or undercooked seafood increases a person's risk for getting Vibrio, and then also being in salty water, especially warm salty water, and exposing a wound is risky. So if a person is going to go swim in Galveston in July and they have a open wound, a scrape, anything, they should cover that with a bandage before going in. Incubation is 1 to 3 days, and then typical signs are abdominal cramping, nausea, vomiting, fever, and chills. Now we'll go into some guidelines released by the USDA as part of the dietary guidelines in 2015. So some guidelines for cleaning. You already know that cross-contamination is a major risk for foodborne illnesses in kitchens. When someone's preparing like a bird or something, they can get a bunch of juices on their hands. Then you open the refrigerator and contaminate the handle to get your rosemary out, and then you contaminate the handle of the oven to put the chicken in the oven. So you can just get bacteria all over the kitchen that way. So it's important to clean these surfaces regularly, recognizing that there could be bacteria living on those surfaces. Hand washing with hot water and soap is definitely recommended. It's recommended to keep washing your hands for at least 20 seconds. You can sing happy birthday to yourself twice to get the right amount of time. Frequent cleaning of surfaces and appliances is important, especially those handles that we tend to touch a lot with dirty hands. The USDA, HHS recommend hot soapy water and not necessarily some antimicrobial spray. All produce should be washed right before eating it, and this is especially important when that food is consumed raw. And one important thing to remember is that even when you plan to peel or remove the exterior of the fruit or vegetable, it's still important to clean the outside because you can transfer the bacteria from the interior to the exterior to the interior when cutting through with a knife, for example. So, of course, in preparation of food, we need to keep our cooked food and our food that we're about to cook in separate places. So we want to make sure we're using different utensils to flip the burgers as we are to pull the burgers off the grill. We want to put our cooked burgers on different plates as the raw burgers. We want to use separate cutting boards. So in my own kitchen, I have black cutting boards for any fleshy thing that's going to be cooked. And then I have tan cutting boards for fruits and vegetables. We want to cook to safe internal temperature. So we'll look at the safe temperatures in a minute that are released in the 2015 dietary guidelines. Keep foods out of the danger zone of 41 degrees to 139 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is the range where bacteria are more likely to grow, and depending on the pathogen, their growth rates will be different throughout the spectrum, but definitely keeping foods below 40 degrees if they're cold and above 140 degrees if they're hot is safest. So, of course, you want to have your fridge temperature below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. It's also recommended to have your freezer temperature below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So, guidelines for behavior. People should avoid the consumption of raw and undercooked animal products. It's something we do a lot, especially with eggs, ground beef, dairy, and seafood. So eggs, we like our sunny side up eggs and our over easy eggs, my favorite, but it's not the healthiest way and safest way to eat eggs. Ground beef, major cause is like rare, medium rare hamburgers. That's not safe. Dairy, raw milk is becoming more popular again. Cheeses made with raw milk aren't the safest. Seafood, people like their raw oysters and their sushi and things like that. Again, there are risks associated with consuming these foods. Pregnant women, children, and people with compromised immune systems, like people with HIV/AIDS, are more likely to get foodborne illnesses and also more likely to die from foodborne illnesses. So they have to be a little more careful and take some extra precautions. Especially pregnant women should avoid soft cheeses that have been made with raw milk. Raw sprouts, vegetable sprouts tend to, or bean sprouts tend to have higher amounts of bacteria in them that are difficult to get rid of. Women who are pregnant should also reheat lunch meat and other cured meats to prevent listeria because those foods are more likely to carry listeria, and the consequences are more severe for pregnant women, potentially. If you want to read more about this, you can see the text of the dietary guidelines beginning on page 119 in the link below. So here are the safe cooking temperatures. So you can see for any form of poultry, the safe cooking temperature is 165 degrees. For ground meats, the safe temperature is 160 degrees. For fresh beef, veal, and lamb, The internal temperature for steaks, roast, and chops can be 145 degrees. That's also appropriate temperature for fish, 145. You'll see an internal inconsistency in the table where fresh pork steaks, for example, look like they can be cooked to 145, but then later fresh pork also has its own category where they recommend to cook it to 160. So I would say if you ever get a question on like the RD exam or something about cooking temperature for pork, I would still go for that higher number, like 160. Eggs should be cooked until they're firm, don't have any runny components. Egg dishes, however, should be cooked to 160. Shellfish we actually cook based on how they look, so they should become a milky white color. Shrimps and lobsters should turn from gray silver to orange. For anything with a shell, they should be cooked until their shells are open. And then leftovers should be cooked to 165 degrees to be safe. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about antibiotic resistance. So there's basically two ways that antibiotics are becoming more resistant, or two ways humans are interfering to create populations of antibiotic resistant bacteria. One way is improper administration to humans. So only about half of the antibiotics administered to humans are actually used to treat a bacterial infection. The other half are used to when there's really a parasite or a virus to blame for the illness, and then an antibiotic is prescribed improperly. So under that circumstance, or under a circumstance where animals are being fed antibiotics routinely to promote growth or to promote more milk production or something like that, we can create kind of these superbugs. So looking at the figure here, in condition 1, we see that this represents, the gut microbiome. Routine antibiotic administration really creates a competitive advantage for the bugs that are naturally drug resistant. So it's a main mechanism by which antibiotic resistant bacteria are created. So normal microbiome, there's lots of different germs, and a couple of them are drug resistant, but they're at no particular advantage against the other germs, and their populations aren't necessarily going to explode and get out of control. When that, say, animal receives an antibiotic, it kills off all of their good bacteria and any bad bacteria that are maybe causing an illness, and just leaves the drug-resistant bacteria there to multiply without competition. So those bacteria grow and grow and grow and become most of the microbiome. And then, unfortunately, bacteria also have this crazy ability to confer their DNA on other bacteria, so they can actually transfer their drug-resistant properties to other bacteria and exacerbate the problem that way. So here's just a little picture showing you the two different ways people can kind of, how antibiotics administration can make people sick with antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So in the condition on the left, these little animals, the chicken, the cow, and the pig, are being fed, antibiotics to promote their growth. And then they develop drug-resistant bacteria in their microbiome, and then in slaughter, some of their intestinal contents can get on the meat, and then humans can inadvertently consume those intestinal bacteria when undercooking a meat or through cross-contamination, and then themselves have these drug-resistant bacteria in their own bowels. Another way is that those animals' manure can be used to fertilize fields that have vegetables and fruits, and then people can consume those bacteria through improper washing of those produce items and become sick that way. Alternatively, the scenario we just talked about, where a person is prescribed antibiotics that causes bacterial resistant microbes to build up in the gut, and then that person, if they're not washing their hands and stuff, they can spread that resistant microbe around the community, and then spread antimicrobial resistant bacteria around the community that way. So Some bacteria we're seeing more resistance than others, so the CDC compiled this list, which shows you the type of bacteria that have shown to have greater propensity for becoming antibiotic resistant. There's a link there if you want to read more about that. Okay, now talking about the FDA also kind of regulates use of antibiotics in animals to some extent. Right now there's a number of over-the-counter antibiotics that farmers can use in their animals that the FDA is asking pharmaceutical companies to label differently. So pharmaceutical companies are asking pharmaceutical companies to label those antibiotics for their approved purposes and not for production purposes. And production purposes are things like allowing the animal to get larger or enabling them to consume less food and get larger, things like that. So production purposes. But the FDA does approve, so the FDA wants approval only for the following uses. One is disease treatment of a sick animal. I think we can all be on board with that. Disease control for a group of animals when some of the animals are sick. So you have a group of animals who are housed together. A couple of them are obviously sick with a bacterial infection. You can treat the whole group to prevent the spread of that infection. And then disease prevention for animals that are at risk of becoming sick. And this is where some people are thinking antibiotics could still be abused if this rule is applied too liberally. But the example given on their website is if little calves are transported in poor weather conditions when they arrive to the farm they're going to, they can be very vulnerable to certain bacterial illnesses, so it might be appropriate in that circumstance to feed the whole crop that came in that night antibiotics to prevent them from getting sick. This is a voluntary thing that the FDA is asking pharmaceutical companies to do, but they're thinking that it's the fastest route to getting a handle on some of these issues with antibiotic resistant bacteria. So there's more information there if you want to read about it. The CDC has an initiative called the National Antimicrobial Resistance Monitoring System, and it is a combined effort between the CDC but also FDA, USDA, and local and state health departments to track the resistance of foodborne and other gut bacteria. So they're actually taking samples and evaluating how many bacteria are antibiotic resistant. So if you're interested in looking at that, you can check out the antibiotic resistant maps. So in summary, we talked about some common foodborne illnesses as identified by the CDC. You should know all the content on that table for your RD exam and this class. We talked about cleaning and preparation guidelines released with the 2015 dietary guidelines. We talked about some food behaviors that Americans should avoid, and some in particular that pregnant women should avoid and do. We talked about safe cooking temperatures for different types of meat, so you definitely need to memorize those and know them. Then antimicrobial resistance is a problem. You should be able to explain how routine feeding of antibiotics to animals or improper use in humans can lead to the development of antibiotic resistant bacteria.